Welcome back to the Politics with Paul podcast. I am your host, Paul Rayner. Today's a special episode because we have a guest. But before we get to that and today's topic, as always, a disclaimer, whether you're new to the show or not. As a nonpartisan analyst, I do not take a specific stance for or against anybody's particular views or any particular groups they belong to. But nonetheless, I believe today's guest has a very worthwhile viewpoint to discuss on a topic that just about all of us can agree poses a serious problem for our political system, regardless of our political leanings. Today, we're going to talk about gerrymandering and its negative impacts down the line, including how it affects voter turnout amongst Democrats, Republicans, and independents alike, how it affects political discourse. Political competitiveness and fair elections are core pieces to the health of American governance, but all too often the specter of gerrymandering threatens it. But it's a complex and deep topic, one that today's special guest has a lot of experience dealing with. And that guest is Mary Noone. Mary Noone is a seasoned campaign strategist and advocate who has translated her business experience into the campaign world. She's particularly experienced in Indiana, her current state, and growing up in Massachusetts, she sees up close the stark difference of what governing looks like. Governing that she says benefits the collective. Experienced personally the impact of a red, or as Mary refers to as a rigged state, and a blue state can be an eye-opening experience. Currently, she is the president of Mary Noone Campaign Strategy, and previously she co-founded and served as the president of Hoosier Victory Alliance, and she was also the chair of the Indiana Women's Action Movement. So, without further ado, let's get into the topic of gerrymandering, and please welcome Mary Noone. Mary, how are you doing today?
Good. How are you, Paul?
I'm doing good. We got a special guest, you, right on here, so this is a good day. So, let's just get right into it. What are a couple examples of gerrymandering that you have seen in your work in campaigns and advocacy?
Yeah, when we start talking about gerrymandering, I like to put it in three buckets because it's a very complex issue, as you know. There's the technical aspect that we have to talk about. There's the downstream and impact, which I talk about voter apathy. And then there's the real world consequences of gerrymandering. So to step back to understand gerrymandering, we have to understand how we got here. Like, why is this a hot topic? Why do some states talk about gerrymandering and others do not? And gerrymandering came from the sheer fact that in 2008, after Obama got elected, some people on the GOP side were like, whoa, wait a minute. How do we gain our power back? What tools in the toolbox do we have to gain more seats in our congressional and state houses? And what they did was they turned to Karl Rove, and they turned to another gentleman by the name of Thomas Hoffeller. He was down in North Carolina. He has since passed away. And they gave him the challenge of looking at the golden question, how do we gain our power back? And they came up with this project called Red Map. And they threw in $60 million behind this project. And what happened in this project is very interesting. If you'd like to follow the history, if you'd like to get in the weeds, some folks might. There was a great book written about this project. It's called Rat FU, and I won't finish the statement, but by David Daly. And he really outlines the complexity of gerrymandering, but what really happened. And Thomas, who was the orchestrator strategist behind it, basically changed the concept of redistricting. And this is where we need to start. And I'm going to read exactly because I don't like to misquote folks. He basically said, usually the voters get to pick the politicians. In redistricting, the politicians now get to pick the voters. So when you say that, you're like, well, wait a minute. That's not democracy. How did we get here? And how we got here was this $60 million Red Map project that took away your voice, created this system that we're now trying to operate in or get out of, that really took the power away from the people. And like he said, put the power in the politicians. And we all know we don't want that power to be there. It's supposed to be democratic. So that's where I like to start is like, how do we get here? This is the technical start. We have to kind of pull back the layers.
Right. So actually getting a little bit more into that technical aspect. So we have two main types of gerrymandering, right? And regardless of political affiliation, they've both been used. So we have packing, where you put as many voters of the opposite party into a district as possible. So it's much easier to win all these other districts. And then there's fracking, where you try to dilute voters of the opposing party by diffusing them across as many districts as possible so they can't mount any challenge in those areas. Do you see one as more insidious and common than the other? Or are they both pretty prevalent and on the same level of unfairness, in your opinion?
Good question. So the packing and cracking, cracking a district, it doesn't matter which tool they use in the toolbox. It's all driven by data. So if you were to use Thomas's example, he was a GOP strategist. It's all data driven. It's all census driven. It's all the best of the best looking at voter data, moving data. When branders go out there, my background is in marketing, and a brander will find out people's likes and dislikes, and you can kind of forecast and draw some conclusions. They layered and unlayered a lot of data and used algorithms to figure out what people's persuasions were hypothetically, and that's how you get to the district mapping. He did it so strategically that the reason we found out of Thomas's mastermind plan was, this is a little interesting history for those who likes the history and how this all happens, is Thomas's daughter and him were estranged. He passes away. She decides to go to the house, as some, children do. You go through your collectibles, your items, and she finds a box. And in the box is all his notes, because he never emailed people. He never did anything and put anything in a digital record. It was all on floppies. She's like, what's these? Well, she starts looking at these floppies, and I know myself, I don't know about you, but if I had a floppy, I was like, I had to go find a computer to put it in.
Yeah.
So she does that, and she's like, holy cow. And she runs to Common Cause down in North Carolina where she lived, and she hands it over to them. So that's when this gets starting, the layers start getting pulled back. So it's data driven. So whether you're cracking or packing, it really doesn't matter. It's the end goal you're after. So it's just the tools they're using to either break up communities or put them all in one district. Now you're probably like, well, why does that matter? Well, that matters because look at some districts that I used to live in Massachusetts or some here in Indiana. When you have a district that encompasses a section of a rural area, a big swath of it, and then a section that goes all the way up into the urban area, because it's based on population, and in our area that encompasses our population are vaster, they're much larger. So if you've got different interests, as the representative, you're creating a lot of animosity and tension within your district, because you've got a big water issue you're dealing with. You've got a data center coming, and the rural areas and the farmers like, well, wait a minute, you just took our water source for irrigation for our farmers. And the urban areas are like, well, this big data center is coming over here. We want the water. So now you're not getting into a constructive dialogue. You're favoring who paid for you to get in office. That's where the going down the money trail impacts, because however you got in office that's why AOC will say, I don't take lobbies dollars. I don't take special interest groups, because she wants to be able to have a conversation with her voters. And when you start looking at the real life issues and consequences, that's where it comes into play.
Gotcha. The whole floppy disk part, that just is kind of funny. I have a fascination with older computers, so just hearing that stuff. I mean, obviously, I don't think I have a computer that can use those now, but just goes to show you just how long the gerrymandering has been an issue. Although obviously, how it looks is a bit different now. But before we get
actually really recent. Thomas just recently passed away. This wasn't something.
Oh, okay.
He just chose to use that type of tool because he didn't want to leave a digital footprint that you and I all know that when we share emails, going to send somebody else. He was involved when Trump was in office, when we were doing the censoring, because he was trying to forecast what that meant. So he's been involved in this for quite a long time. He just chose to use that tool because you can obviously draw conclusions here as why he's using floppies is because he doesn't want anybody to get a hold of his work.
Right. Yeah. It is scary just how good these algorithms are getting. You feel like you say something, not even into the computer, and all of a sudden, oh, did this computer hear me? It feels like that sometimes. So before we get more into the effects that you see from gerrymandering, because it's easy to just say, oh, gerrymandering's bad, but before we get to that, just a little bit more about how gerrymandering exactly looks. So how do we point to districts to be able to say, okay, that's clearly drawn in a deliberately in a deliberate way to benefit one party? Because you can look at some districts and say, okay, that's not a legitimate shape. That's clearly meant to benefit somebody. But what about the less obvious cases? How do we sniff out those cases of gerrymandering?
That's a good question, because I think you have to, go back. The question you're asking is, how do we know my district is gerrymandered, right? And it's what's happening in your district. It's okay. For example, you open up a bill that you get from the doctor, and all of a sudden your bill is, the same procedure that on an annual screening that you had was normally a co-payment or an extra payment of $100. And then the next year you're like, why do I have to pay $500 for this? So people don't start peeling back the layers until they're triggered. And when they're triggered, then they start, hey, why is this? And then they call the doctor, or they call the office, and they say, well, that's what your health insurance is now paying for. I'm like, well, why is that? You go online, then you do a little research, and you realize, oh, wait a minute. The bill that was passed says hospitals can now charge an additional surcharge for all these 10 procedures. And then you're like, oh, here's my representative. He voted for that. So it's not a thing that we are used to doing. It's not a normal cause and effect. But what happens is people are getting more and more triggered of wondering why things are happening. I'll give you another example. Here in Indiana, we had this big data center. We have 3 of them coming to Indiana. And a lot of folks are, the first, for lack of a better word, it's enticing. You're like, a big business is coming here. One of them is Microsoft. Another one is Amazon. And I'm going to blank out on the third one. But when the center was coming, it was a big sale of somebody who was aging out of farming, a family farm, and they wanted to sell their property. Okay, understandable. You want to sell your property. You've been in the farming business for 70 years. Nobody in your family is taking it over. Great. But in that process of selling the farm, the community wanted to know, okay, what kind of impact is it going to have on us? Because this data center is coming. That's electricity. That's a huge amount of water. That's traffic flow. That's neighborhoods. And on that side of the district, it is much more rural. That's where the baseball fields are. That's where all the community space is. And there was also a creek, an environmental creek that services a lot of recreational activities, and it has been being protected in the wetlands. And the community said, well, whoa, wait a minute. This big center's coming here. Well, what about all these issues we need to discuss, right? Because they were triggered. So there's a community meeting that happens, and 300 people show up to ask a lot of these questions of their representatives. A lot of these environmental questions. So rewind, in our legislative session in 2023, they reclassified that legislator, their representatives, who they're now trying to ask questions to. Now, keep in mind, the representatives in that district, the state legislator, senator, and the state representative, did not show up for the meeting. They don't have to. They don't have to answer these questions. The questions they were asking was a lot of environmental, water, electricity bills. When you go back in the 2023 session, because this was last year in 2024, they already reclassified lands, large swaths of lands across Indiana. So no longer do corporations, when they come into the area, have to put in some environmental protections, rewrite the water, make sure that the common spaces, the common lands are protected. People are scratching their head. They're like, well, why not? Well, your representatives voted for it last year. So what's happening is representatives are not showing up when people have a concern, because people are busy. Their heads are down. They're raising their families. They're going to work. And when they raise their hand because they're triggered, remember, people don't take action because it's till they're triggered, and they're trying to get answered, and it's too late. The project is already down the pike. People are making decisions on your behalf. So that's how gerrymandering is affecting people. And now that the problems are getting worse, people are starting to wake up and want to say, and they're frustrated because their voices aren't being heard because, like I said, project's already down the pike. That's already been decided. Sorry, but representatives don't even show up.
So actually, this made me think of another question, and this isn't really quite a consensus. It seems to be the popular opinion, but I don't think it's quite a consensus. Is some data suggests that more and more people are finding neighborhoods to move to where they find people that are more like them politically. So the idea is that more Republicans are moving to Republican areas and more Democrats are moving to Democratic areas. Again, not necessarily consensus, but do you think, or do you agree with that? And B, do you think that that is also a potential contributor to gerrymandering where, okay, maybe at some point this district wasn't so unfairly leaning one way, but maybe further down the road when more and more people move there, maybe then it technically becomes unfair? Do you see it that way?
That's the social fallout. That is really, and that creates, so I think that's the after effect. Going back to the tools that the representatives use to gerrymander, and it imposes this feeling of like, I grew up in Massachusetts, an Irish Boston area. I grew out in the central Mass, but then I moved to Boston and everybody talks about politics. You got Tip O'Neill, you've got the Kennedys, you got Fitzy, Rose Kennedy's father. And we've stopped talking about politics. So as a result, the question, going back to your question, is people want to know who their neighbors are, because they're nervous because we've become so polarized. That's the fallout of gerrymandering, is we've become so polarized rather than just moving into a neighborhood and going to your neighbor with a bundt cake and saying, hey, I just moved in. You want to come over from coffee? People want to know who they're living next to now because of the impact. And that's not how we should be living.
Right. No, absolutely. And it's something I've been working a lot on, writing and a public speaking topic on polarization in general, but a couple of those things are definitely going to be a part of it. So you know what? Let's keep this track on. I'll get to another question that I was going to ask, but let's keep on this whole effects of gerrymandering, because besides hindering electoral competitiveness, and you already talked about a couple of potential effects, what are some of the other problems that you see that have arisen from gerrymandering? For example, do you see any particular effects on voter participation?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Indiana is now 50th in voter turnout. It creates, like, as I mentioned, it has three impacts. You've got the technical thing that's going on. And then the other one is voter apathy, because people feel like they don't have agency. They don't feel like they can make an impact. For example, I've been involved in campaigns, and there are times where I'm out there with the candidate knocking on doors, and I was with a candidate, and one of this candidate is really crafty and in terms of very skilled at connecting with voters. And this young woman was on her porch, and she was doing some studying in college age. And this was during the Dobbs decision, taking her agency away. And she said, I don't do politics. And the candidate goes, oh, no. Politics does you. Let me sit down and tell you.
Yeah.
This impacts you. So people have stepped out of the process, and they feel like they don't have any control because it's so gerrymandered. And then those who are in control get louder and louder. And so when people feel like they don't have a means to change things, they step out of the process. Because, as we know, gerrymandering, as we talked about, is data-driven. They look at how to keep control, regardless of what side of party you are. A lot of people will say New York really, plays with the boundaries, and isn't a true representative of the voters. But then they go to step number 2. They change who can vote, when you can vote, who should be on the roll. So they start to take away more and more of your agency. So when people don't feel like they have power, they give up, because we're all working, raising kids, the daily life struggles and challenges. When you don't feel like you have agency, you start participating. And that's the larger effect. That's what they want. They don't want people to participate. For example, here in Indiana, one of the good things is our early voting time is 30 days. You can vote early for 30 days. Now, within those 30 days, there's different counties do different hours, etc. But when you're out there and you're asking people, why didn't you vote? Here's what they say. Oh, I was at work and my boss asked me to do X, Y, and Z, and I had to stay longer and I didn't get to vote. Because here in Indiana, they close the voting places at 6:00 at night. Okay, that's a challenge. You get out of work at 5:30, you get home, you make sure the kids are there. There's not enough time to turn around to go to vote. So they constantly chip away at your agency. And when you've lost the power to participate, until something bad happens. We are creatures of habits. That's when people start waking up. When the people start taking their power back, that's when things are going to change.
Yeah, that's interesting. 6 o'clock, because down here in Florida, it's actually, or at least for my county, it's 7 o'clock. Um, you touched a little bit on it with the whole political efficacy. Didn't quite say that word, but that's what you were referring to.
Yeah.
And it's just kind of funny because I just did my last episode of the podcast was just me talking about political efficacy, and I didn't even get onto the gerrymandering aspect. But let's shift gears a little bit here and talk a little bit more about why, I guess, sort of why gerrymandering is still able to happen. So talk about Supreme Court cases, and the Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court, state Supreme Courts, they've dealt with gerrymandering before, and some people would probably say insufficiently. So do you think that in your opinion, do you think the U.S. Supreme Court or even state Supreme Courts have been effective in tackling the issue of gerrymandering, more specifically on partisan lines versus, say, racial gerrymandering, which has been strongly addressed previously?
Right. I think before we even get there, we got to step back. So how do states actually decide their boundaries, their congressional and their state house boundaries? There's three avenues they can use or tools that they use. One is some states are now gone to independent commissions where it's an outside source, again, data driven to decide the regulations. And there's different representatives on equal sides on these independent commissions. It's how they've decided to have their districts drawn. The other one is legislators control, when the legislators decide. They hire somebody, and if they're in control, you got to wonder who they're going to hire, okay? And they make all the decisions. And then the other one is political commissions, where they have equal representation on each side, and they hash out the differences, and they go back and forth. And it does have to go to a vote into their state house if they're a supermajority, or that's where it plays out a little bit more intensely. So you have those, step one, you had those commissions that decide what the districts are. Now, within that work, if they did some cracking and packing, then you can take it up to your courts, your state courts, and then your Supreme Court. Now, keep in mind, if you're in a very gerrymandered one-control state, over the years, you've also packed your court. You also packed your state house. Your state house has packed your Supreme Court. Now, if your Supreme Court is very much in lockstep with your state house, they're going to pause it right there. They're going to find, legal reasoning for why they feel this is not disenfranchising voters, and then it doesn't get up to the Supreme Court. That's why everybody's really watching North Carolina and the recounting of that Supreme Court race, because that's your step one. You can't get it out of the state level court system. You can't get it up to the Supreme Court for them to really imply the Voting Rights Act and the litmus test the tools that they have. And then you've got states like down south in Mississippi, was it Mississippi, Louisiana, that they deemed it, I forgot which district. It was one of the districts it's in Louisiana. It was one of the city districts around New Orleans, and they deemed it, they packed everybody in, and they deemed it unconstitutional. Now it needs to go back to the state house, and they need to redraw it. They said, no, we're not going to do it. So now you're in a court battle. The election time ticks on, and you have to hold an election. So they're pausing and using the legal system to their advantage. So there are tools in our toolbox. Are the courts working? Yes. If you want to follow more of this, I highly recommend following Democracy Docket with Mark Elias. He really follows these cases, and he has his teams on the ground. Because at the end of the day, I'll share a story with you. Healthcare. We all need healthcare, right? It's universal, regardless of your political affiliation. Here in Indiana, we have the highest healthcare costs, and most of it's associated with the hospitals. Now, keep in mind, when you're in Indiana, you have the small nonprofit hospitals closing up, all being gobbled up by the bigger hospitals. We even have the leading economists here in Indiana have claimed that our hospital system is a perfect example of a monopoly. Now, peel back the layers, you look at all our representatives, they're all on the take, I like to say, because they're all getting their dollars, their campaign dollars from the hospital associations, etc. But how does it impact you? It impacts employees and employers because they have to dole out the highest healthcare costs to cover their employers. They pull back in their coverage. But to even go back even further, I'll give you a true example. So we have a great organization here in Indiana. The doctors have come together because they see this impacting them and their patient care. It's called Good Health Coalition, Good Trouble Coalition. They're doctors and healthcare providers that have come together and say, wait a minute, we need to follow the health legislation going through much closer with a medical expert in the room to help dissect what this impact is to our consumers, like cost and price. So you need your annual screenings. We all get to be age 45, 50, depending on where you live. You need a colonoscopy, right? Your general practitioner will say, okay, it's that year. You need to go have that screening because we all know that's the screening preventative for cancer down the road. And you go out to the desk, and what do? They make the appointment for you, right? Like they say, oh, there's an opening over here at this clinic, or you're 5 minutes from the hospital because that's where you work and you want to go to the hospital to have that outpatient taken care of, right? So it's up to scheduling availability and location, right? Little did you know, because we're back to monopolies in the hospitals, that if you happen to get that appointment scheduled at the hospital, it is 5.7 times cost dinged on if you're on Medicaid, because that's where it's going right now. Medicaid, the hospital gets to charge Medicaid 5.7 times more than if you walk over to it in outpatient centers that we know we have a lot of them around to have the same procedure. Why is that? You wonder why our healthcare costs are so high is because we've got a system that is allowing people and the folks in the state house not to have someone challenge them. It comes back to accountability. Because let me take this one step further. So you've got that real life impact happening. Nobody's calling out that state legislator because the hospital got to take in more money. Woohoo! They got to make more money off of your health care. But who's holding that elected official accountable to change the system? In a very gerrymandered state, people stop running against these highly gerrymandered representatives. So nobody's challenging them. When you're not being challenged, there's no accountability. When there's no accountability, it comes back and impacts you.
Right. And that's, I mean, you really went down the rabbit hole. But I mean, when it comes to politics, there's pretty much always a rabbit hole to go down to. I mean, everything's got to be convoluted, sometimes more than it really needs to be. But want to step back a little bit into earlier in your answer to that question, because actually is a perfect segue, talking a bit about the basic methods that you use in redistricting. So just to reiterate, states give redistricting authority to either their state legislatures, a commission outside the legislature, which might or might not have politicians on it, depending on the state, or to both the state legislature and an outside commission. I want to say it's Virginia and New York that use that. I can't remember exactly who Ballotpedia.
Yeah.
Yeah. But so according to Ballotpedia, and full disclosure, I am a former employer of Ballotpedia. But that's not why I'm highlighting them. They just do fantastic work. 33 states' legislatures redraw congressional district boundaries, not including the states that only have one U.S. House district. And 34 states' legislatures redraw state legislative district boundaries. Now, of course, it's easy to see the incentive for a state legislator to redraw district lines to benefit themselves. But do you feel any particular state has a well-thought-out system for redistricting congressional and or state legislative district lines? And if so, which state?
That's a good question. Personally, I would love to see enacted in the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, redistricting done by independent commissions. Let's just give the voice back to the people. If we have independent commissions, data-driven results, using data, using the systems that are out there. I'll give you an example. In Indiana, during the redistricting in 2020, there was a coalition that came together with Common Cause, ACLU, 24 other nonprofits, nonpartisan, and they used data-driven with professors from around the state and outside the state to really look at what would be the fairest ultimate. And they did it. Not only did they have the commission and representatives on this commission from all different communities across the state, they even did surveys and polls and asked the community members, the voting populace, what do you want? Do you want to have the redistricting done in a way that's fair? And you define fair. what is fair, and they wanted fair representation, and they wanted a independent commission. So this independent commission, they even had contests so people could really get a kind of civic excitement about it, like getting the power back to the people. Because when you give people back their power, they get engaged and they participate. And the challenge with that, these state legislative commissions that are completely controlled, when it goes to the state house, even though all that work was done, they only had, I believe it was a 2-hour hearing to present all this information. And then they said, okay, thank you very much. They went behind closed doors. No, here's the map we want. Done. They voted on it. It's done. So to answer your question, states that have got it right are states that are using independent commissions, using the tools in the toolbox, because we know how to do this, and letting the people then vote and having representatives, debates, discourse, accountability back in their districts to see who's going to be the representative. Michigan got it right when they moved in 2018 to independent commission, and now they've got it pretty balanced. When you've got state houses that teeter back and forth to who is in control, Pennsylvania goes back and forth. Michigan's going back and forth. That's okay. That's healthy. When you've got leaders, you might find this quite comical. Because when you think about it, you're like, are you kidding me? When you've got leaders who've been leading for so long and nobody's holding them accountable. Our House majority leader, Todd Huston, just commissioned a committee in our state legislature to discuss annexing 14 counties in Illinois to bring them over into Indiana, because we want more people over here in Indiana that think like us, these rural counties in Illinois. Seriously? Like, that's how you're spending your time, where people need to talk about the cost of electricity, putting food on the table. Indiana is the most polluted state because we still burn coal. And you're talking about annexing counties from Chicago, from Illinois.
Actually, that makes me think of, there was, I don't think I ever really seriously reached anything, but I remember hearing like a year or two ago talking about either Idaho annexing Oregon counties or Oregon. I think it was Idaho annexing Oregon counties, and it's just, it kind of makes me think of that whole, whenever anybody, I've heard Democrats and Republicans both say it, that we need to have like a national divorce of red states and blue states. First of all, that doesn't help anybody. That's just going to make things worse. And second of all, it does not divide evenly in terms of geography the way that a lot of people think it would. But before I get to the next question, since you touched on a little bit, with these independent commissions, you talked about places like Michigan and Pennsylvania that have pretty even state legislative chambers. Minnesota, I guess Minnesota's maybe to a little bit of a lesser extent, but I mean, their house just flipped as well. But how do you ensure that a commission is independent? Because we did just a little bit ago, we talked about how some independent commissions can technically have politicians on it, or they have to have people that won't run for office, but perhaps they might be could potentially be lobbyists affiliated with a party, or somebody from a party. How do we go about ensuring that these are independent commissions?
That's a good question. It just as you go down the slippery slope of becoming super gerrymandered, when you take away that and you're starting to get a balance in your state house, and when you're picking the commissioner, if you pick the commissioner, the business, and you have equal representation and you do it in a transparent way, not behind closed doors, and you have these open law meetings and everybody is welcome in the room, that's how you really do it. It's really not necessarily just about who's sitting around the table. It's about how the process has been conducted and allowing people to be in there, allowing the media to be in there, allowing the minutes to be read, in a very transparent process. But when it's happening behind closed doors and there's 2 or 3 people involved, that's really where we run into a lot of problems. It's about transparency and accountability. And meetings.
Absolutely. Yep, transparency. It always makes government better when you have more transparency. So what are some other steps that we can take, big or small, to make gerrymandering less common? Are there any reforms that aren't necessarily directly related to redistricting that can be implemented that might alleviate gerrymandering? For example, do you think term limits would have any sort of impact on that?
That's a really good question. So I go back and forth with term limits because, there's different levels of term limits. Obviously, you look at, Mitch McConnell, who's really aging, and you're like, okay, we need to let the gentleman served us well. Thank you very much. Time for somebody else. But when you talk about term limits, where people just say, I want people in there for 2 terms, or I just want people in their office for 1 or 3, there's the other equation that really landed for me as you start getting into, as we say, the weeds and understanding the process behind the curtain. So you want somebody in your community to represent your community. And a lot of times, let's take somebody gets into office in the state level, and they're really well versed in education. And that's the offering they're going to add to the collective. And there's somebody else from the neighboring district who is a healthcare provider. So you want that voice in there, right? But the person who is well versed in education also needs to sit on a couple other committees, right? AKA, here comes the lobbyists. So then what happens is the lobbyists come in, and their job really is to be on the up and up and educate the representatives on other issues, let's say environmental issues, electricity, or the water sources, or lead, or whatever the need is in the community. And if a well-constructed lobby group is doing their work, they're going to educate the representatives on the facts. But at the same time, we know lobbyists like to butter up, and they like to pay for lunch. They like to pay for a conference, and they're going to just woo and wine and dine you. But what happens is, as a new representative, you're kind of like drinking from the fire hose, because there's a lot of bills. When you think about it, a lot of these state sessions are only for 4 or 5 months. 4 months here in Indiana during a budget year, and you're talking about an exorbitant amount of dollars you're responsible for allocating and spending. You're learning very quickly. You're technically supposed to file up to 15 bills yourself. So if you think about it, there's 100 people in there. You're all filing 15 bills. You got to learn about the ins and outs of all those bills and the details and the larger impact and the legal ramifications. That's a lot to take in. So you should rely on good lobbyists to say, okay, this is going to affect this business. Indiana is the RV capital of the world. How is that going to impact that business if the steel is not, taxed here and there from federal level, and what's the impact on the state level? So they need information. But what happens is when the lobbyists are whining and dining, you can kind of get lost in that. In other words, they end up having the power because they have the information. But when a state representative is in there longer and longer, they understand the playing game. They understand the chess pieces. They understand, like, well, that guy really, or female, really didn't tell me the true story. They didn't tell me the whole history. I found out more. I got to know the owner of this company. I got to know, and they have a better understanding of the landscape, so they can better make a well-grounded decision. That takes time. It takes time for a really good representative to get grounded and build those relationships and understand the larger impact of the decisions. But we also need them to be, when they run every year, to be running against somebody that holds them accountable to those decisions that they made. That's where we need to put the power, is back with the voters. So if it's not gerrymandered and someone says, well, we didn't like those 2 decisions you made on X, Y, and Z, let's challenge them and hold them accountable and let them answer to these questions. And if they get reelected, great. If they don't, they don't. But by having term limits, we're really throwing the balance of power into the lobbyists, into that whining and dining and wooing and we'll pay for your campaign. And we know they do that because in Indiana, there's very, like we call it, loosey-goosey state campaign finance laws. They actually call Indiana the Wild Wild West with campaign donations.
Yeah, when you bring up lobbyists, it is kind of, for all the issues that lobbyists bring, it is kind of that, every so often you hear people say, we need to get rid of lobbyists. Like, well, there's a lot of unintended consequences there if you do get rid of it. And then also if you phrase it as, well, do you think we should have advocates? Then all of a sudden, you change the language a little bit, then suddenly people become more amenable. Right. So for the penultimate question on gerrymandering, at least, how do we disincentivize these politicians from gerrymandering? Because politicians need incentives, right? Arguably, humanity in general has things that incentivize them to do something. So, is there any way we can convince politicians across the political aisle that if they redraw lines to unfairly benefit themselves or their party, that would actually hurt them electorally, legally, financially? How do we disincentivize politicians from trying to redraw lines unfairly?
Yeah, I think the question is really we need to reframe and take our power back. And it comes from the people. The more we vote and hold them accountable to their votes, that's how we're going to change the system. It's really about getting the folks educated on the impact that the votes that they're doing right now in their state legislators, either on the state level, the congressional level, how it's impacting them, and hold them accountable. Because a challenge state house seat or congressional seat is about accountability. It's answering to the people about the votes that you just made or the work that you're doing. So in order to get that accountability, we have to have someone run against them. And if the district is so gerrymandered, people won't. So in very gerrymandered areas, we like to say, we need to redefine what winning looks like. So if you're in a very gerrymandered district, your job might be to run and to hold the other person accountable for their votes. While you might not win that time, but your job is accountability. And as people start realizing what's happening in your district, then more people will start showing up and start voting potentially to flip and start changing the power structure. And the other side, the other thing that's important in that is some of the very gerrymandering areas. When you look at Georgia, when they're bringing back the balance in Georgia, it happens at the top of the ticket first. What do I mean by that? So when you're in very gerrymandered states, in order for you to flip back and or balance the power, it's just about balancing power and having discourse again, is you have to run candidates in every seat of the bus, regardless if it's very districting. It's back to holding them accountable, making the other side spread their dollars and run in all these districts and have those conversations in front of the voting public about their votes, about their vision, about what they want to see in this district. Because you have people running in very gerrymandered districts and winning, as we see right now in the state of Indiana. We don't have our Congress people coming back and having town halls. They're not people have really concerning questions. Indiana is a farming community. We have the number one tomato and corn. All these farm aid bills that were cut is impacting Indiana. The farmers want answers, communities want answers, and they're not showing up because they don't have to. So how do you change that? You run against them and you make them show up to these town halls. And if they continue not to show up, that's where you have the power and the people is the vote.
It is a shame how many races across really federal, state, and local government, especially with the local level, you just see that there's just nobody to even challenge somebody. And I mean, usually there's an incumbent, but sometimes it's just one person that's a newcomer and they run and nobody else runs against them. It's definitely something that I think, regardless of political opinions, it's a problem that it needs to be addressed.
Yeah.
And I obviously I wish we could say that we solved the issues of gerrymandering with this topic, but nonetheless, thank you again for this really in-depth insight that you have into gerrymandering. So before we wrap things up, I'm gonna go. Actually, first, real quick, any final thoughts about gerrymandering that we haven't really covered that's really pressing for you that you think really needs to get out there?
Yeah, I think it goes back to giving the voice back to the people. We're seeing people feel a loss of agency, and gerrymandering is a big factor that contributes to it. And it's about healthcare. It's about educating our children. It's about giving people access to choice, whatever life path they want to choose. And we have folks who are not thinking about the collective, but they're thinking about, who got them into their seat, or they're voting for reasons that don't serve the area they're supposed to represent. And that's why we have voter apathy and people not paying attention. And the unfortunate part is until bad things happen, that's when people wake up and participate. And we shouldn't have to get to that point. I would hope that people who are elected officials value that oath a lot more and value who they're representing, because we're all human. We got to get back to humaning. That was a friend of word. We got to get back to humaning, that we're all in this together. So the depolarization is really not going to help anybody.
Yeah, absolutely. Because since you brought it up a couple of times, it made me think of the whole, not doing something before it's too late. How I just remember back in grad school, some of the studies that, really, this is just a very crude way to say it, but for a lot of people, it really, unless they have like a particularly strong emotion, like fear, like a fear of, oh, do we need to do something? A lot of times people will just go with the status quo unless they just can't deal with it anymore. So it's obviously a lot of things to consider. But, and again, thank you so much for that insight. Let's go ahead and go to one final question that is just meant to be fun, not non-political, because anytime I have a guest, and sometimes even on my own, I like to pose a random question for both the guest and for the audience. So today's random question of the day is, promise it's not anything crazy. If you could have one superpower, what would it be? And don't cheat and pick something like, invincibility, because that's lame and boring, or ability to absorb other powers. So what's your superpower?
Oh, what's my superpower? Oh God. I think it goes to like, if I could travel in time, if I could travel in time and I could go back to some of these eras, because I love history. I love reading histories and biography. If I could go back to like the Roaring 20s and experience some of that, I think if I could go back in time, I think that if I could travel through time, but then again, I would be like, oh, let me change this. Let's make it better through my lens. But anyway.
For me, that temptation would be too great. But to be able to see things up close, I'd go see like the original Constitutional Convention, signing a Declaration of Independence. Oh, just so many different things. Or to even go back in time. Another question I asked my previous guest is basically if they could pick any single person in history to have a conversation with, who would it be? And I picked Rod Serling from the Twilight Zone. And I was just thinking, well, you know what? With your answer, I could just go back in time and have a conversation with him, because that guy was the definition of prescient. For me, though, I'm going to pick something a little less profound, and for me, it's the ability to manipulate electricity. So when I was a kid, there was a cartoon I watched called Static Shock, and I thought that was he was like the coolest thing ever. It was like, if I could just do things, mundane things like, I got to charge my computer or charge my phone. My car's not starting. I'm going to, jump the battery, or do crazier things like create a light show or manipulate magnetic fields. It's like, that seems like the coolest thing ever. So for me, it's definitely manipulating electricity, and also just having things shoot out of your fingertips. Just sounds rad for me.
Not. I'm thinking Spider-Man. Who was the one who had the electricity? Electric. What was the superhero that had the electric power?
So there is Static Shock. As for another superhero, I'm sure there's somebody else that does it. But I think there's a Spider-Man villain, is it Electro? I think he's more of a villain. Yeah. But there's probably somebody else that I can't really think of. But anyways, that's for me. So, Mary, thank you so much for coming out to the show and for having such an in-depth conversation. That's, obviously it's something that really needs to be talked about. And it's talked about, but really to actually try to do something about it, unfortunately, there's not been a whole lot, or not enough, I should say, that's been done for it. So hopefully we'll see that in the future, and conversations like this will, lead to those solutions. So, and for you at home or wherever you're watching or listening to this, thank you again so much for listening. I've got my links in the show notes, my Facebook, LinkedIn, my book, Why Independents Rarely Win Elections and How They Could Become More Competitive, that's available on Amazon, and several other links that I can't think of off the top of my head. Mary, any links that you would like to share?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. You will find me on LinkedIn. You will also find me on Substack. And my Substack is called 92 County Plan, where I'm outlining how do we unrig a red state? And there's a lot of lessons that you can follow on the journey that you can use in other states, in terms of what's its impact and why we need to unravel this. And you can also find me on Blue Sky, and you can also find me on Facebook. And I don't go on Twitter anymore. It's just a rabbit hole that for me, it's just there's too much going on there. But that's where you find me. LinkedIn and Substacks are the two top places you can find me. Like I said, 92 county plan. And the goal is to talk about how do we unrig some of these rig states so we can get back to having conversations and solving the problems that really impact us all.
Well, there you go. Go ahead and check out all those links that Mary just talked about and mine as well. And please like, comment, share, subscribe the podcast, and for all of Mary's links as well. And that's going to wrap things up for us. So until next time, take care.